Thank you, and good afternoon. Thanks for coming out to hear about the black boxes that link together literature, cybernetics, and affect. So as Darlene mentioned, my name is Heather Love, and I'm excited to have this chance to share some of my research with you today. And as most of you know, this semester's Colloquium series here is set up to demonstrate a variety of different critical approaches to literary study. So last week, Prentice talked about genre in American lit, and then coming up in the next few weeks, we'll hear from Darlene on drama and spectatorship. Skip Willman will be up next with Marxist approaches to literature, and then I'll let you refer to the poster for the rest of the lineup there. But today, I will be talking about the fabulous British modernist author Virginia Woolf, as well as a few of her essays, her 1931 novel The Waves, and her 1937 radio broadcast, which was published in this Death of the Moth volume. And then I'll also be talking about the renowned mid-20th century American psychologist Silvan Tomkins. And he's most famous for the theories that he set out in this massive multi-volume tome titled Affect, Imagery, Consciousness. And I'll be talking about black boxes. So to put this in the broadest terms, the case study that I'll be taking us through today showcases an interdisciplinary approach to literary study by placing literature in conversation with science, broadest terms. And if we zoom in one step closer, then the argument I'll make is tracing a set of connections between literary modernism, so experimental writing from the early decades of the 20th century, and the technological fields of information processing and data management that were also emerging at that time. And these fields would eventually be codified during World War II as cybernetics. And as the title of this talk makes clear, I'll be doing this by bringing together a constellation of writers, fields, and concepts, putting them into contact with one another. So my goal here is to showcase, not simply say how technology influences literature or how literature reflects its broader social context, but rather I'd like to tease out a more dynamic relationship between literary modernism, cybernetics, and affect theory. And a comparative study of the overlapping conceptual frameworks and rhetorical tools that these different discourses use, I'll be arguing, helps us to uncover some really fascinating and important lineages, both intellectual and aesthetic, that span different disciplines, different oceans, and different time periods. But enough of these abstract explanations here, so let's dive into the black box. So the black box thought experiment was originally theorized in the 19th century by a Scottish mathematical physicist named Clerk Maxwell. And then this guy, Ross Ashby, he introduced the idea to cybernetics discourse in 1956. And the black box is basically a model for understanding communication. So it recognizes that observers are always blind to the internal mechanisms at work in anything that they observe. And this construct applies across disciplines. So it's just as relevant to, say, the judges of the Turing Test video game competition who are trying to figure out which online avatars are humans and which ones are machines, as it is to a talk therapist who's trying to figure out how to help her patient deal with, say, shame and anxiety. Both of the observers here operate from positions of ignorance, but from a black box perspective, this potentially frustrating opacity instead becomes the motivation for the observer to try and identify patterns despite this persistent uncertainty. So in other words then, black boxes, they show us that although a particular system may be too complex to fully understand, it's nonetheless still useful to seek some kind of partial explanation for how the system works. So in what's coming up here, I'll be arguing that Silvan Tomkins takes up this cybernetic black box concept in his theory of personality. And the way he does so, I'll show, offers us a helpful lens for understanding Virginia Woolf's literary explorations of human subjectivity and language. Somewhat amusingly, both Woolf and Tomkins here, they pit their versions of black box thinking against an established figure in their respective fields. So for Tomkins, it's Freud. For Woolf, it's Arnold Bennett. And the two black box thinkers, these guys, contrary to those stodgy predecessors, they show us that language and personality can never be transparent. And the best we can hope for is partial understanding. All right, so Woolf explicitly thematizes this perspective in her novel, The Waves, and I'll be looking at that. And she does it by mobilizing the trope of blindness, and I'll be taking up this concept more fully in the second part of the presentation here when I turn to the media context of radio. And so then I'll be exploring Woolf's 1937 BBC talk, which hopefully I will be able to play a clip of for you. We'll see how that goes. And we'll see that over the airwaves, she articulates a theory of language that epitomizes the black box construct and then catapults it into new realms of technological and aesthetic significance. All right, so off we go. Silvan Tomkins. He was a psychologist who conducted postdoc research at Harvard in the 1930s. And then he spent the better part of his career working at Princeton. And he became interested in the affects, which he understood as the primary motivation system for humans. So Tomkins' theories identify this core list of paired affects. And if we have any Pixar fans in the audience, you'll probably recognize a few of the cast members from Inside Out up there. So the linked terms here indicate different levels of intensity. So interest is a weaker form of excitement, and so on down the list. And these affect registers, Tomkins posits, they wield the freedom and flexibility to combine in multiple ways with one another and also to shift their associations over time. So the idea of a connection between Tomkins' affect theories and cybernetics is nothing new. But today, of course, I'll be focusing on the black box as a point of contact between the two of them. And this framework, of course, looks ahead to the eventual destination we have today of opening up some connections to modernist literature as a field, and Virginia Woolf's work in particular. So I know I mentioned this, but just to recap, the black box construct is most basically a strategy for investigating a complex object without knowledge or assumptions about its internal makeup, structure, or parts. And Ranulph Glanville, who was a former president of the American Society for Cybernetics, he explains that the black box gives us a concept that allows us to handle what is, in effect, an unknown world. It is the statement of ignorance, of our ability to overcome and cope with ignorance, and thus is a primitive of learning and hence of science. So on the one hand then, this method, this construct, recognizes and accepts the presence of unconquerable uncertainty. We can see it up there. But on the other hand, it also strives to develop understanding despite the persistent uncertainty. And Tomkins takes up precisely this stance in his approach to human psychology as he navigates a balance between this recognition of ignorance and this attempt to overcome it. So the fact that Tomkins' theories are founded on a willing embrace of uncertainty, ignorance, and complexity is perhaps most easily explained, as I noted earlier, by looking at the way he sets himself up in opposition to Freud. That was the best picture I could find of Freud. So good. Freud, Tomkins argues, confuses the affects with the drives, conflating them rather than recognizing their different levels of complexity. Freud, we know, posits human behavior as governed by the drives, and in doing so, he sets up a fairly rigid system that, at least from Tomkins' perspective, cannot account for the unpredictability that in fact characterizes human psychology. So if you've ever been annoyed while reading Freud, then I guarantee you will enjoy Tomkins' writing, because it includes some gems like these ones, and I'm quoting here. Freud's interpretation of the nature of social relationships was crippled by his dependence on the drive theory. Or Freud was partly the victim of the drive concept. Or Freud mistakenly assumed aggression to be a drive. So this may be the root of my soft spot for Tomkins that you're hearing. But as Tomkins sees it, the freedom of the affect system is antithetical to the structure of the Freudian drive. Affect allows people, he writes here, to invest any and every aspect of existence with the magic of excitement and joy, or with the dread of fear or shame or distress. What he's saying here is that you never know exactly which affects or which combinations of affects are going to stick to a specific object or memory or scenario. And you also don't know how these associations are going to shift over time. So uncertainty rules. However, in keeping with the black box method, Tomkins' embrace of uncertainty does not foreclose, but rather fuels his attempts to better understand affect. he explains each individual affect in as much detail as he can, and he even comes up with a set of general rules for describing the system's overall tendencies. And here they are. Positive affect should be maximized, negative minimized, affect inhibition minimized, and the power to do all of these things, and he really just repeats them word for word, should be maximized. So we have some rules, but you can see that they remain general enough to avoid becoming prescriptive. So we see then that Tomkins' approach to personality balances detailed explanation with an openness to associative unpredictability. And I'm going to shift gears here to propose that this double-pronged approach to affect finds a retrospective sounding board in modernist literature. And in particular, Tomkins' black box framework helps us read Virginia Woolf's literary experiments and better understand her approach to representing human subjectivity. So Woolf's essays from the early decades of the 20th century showcase her approach to representing, or as she puts it in this 1923 piece, catching character. And what I'll be showing here is that she aligns character with the same black box framework we've seen in Tomkins' writings. I like to think of it this way, that basically the process she outlines for authors and readers to engage with characters offers a literary version of the black box method. So perhaps most explicitly, in a 1927 essay titled The Narrow Bridge of Art, she describes modern character as situated within a box. We are cut off from others, she posits, except for waves of sound which pour through the roof and speak aloud to us of battles and murders and strikes and revolutions all over the world. Now these lines nicely foreshadow the upcoming reading I've got of radio and her radio aesthetics, but for the time being, suffice it to say that they reinforce a black box conception of character and communication. So we are opaque to one another in a box, yet we're still able to exchange or engage in productive exchanges via these input-output transmissions. So the importance of this potential for communicational access emerges through Woolf's discussions of interpersonal relationships. She argues that the impulse to accurately read character underlies all human social behavior. So take these remarks here. Everyone in this room, she would declare, is a judge of character. Indeed, it would be impossible to live for a year without disaster unless one practiced character reading and had some skill in the art. Our marriages, our friendships depend on it. Our business largely depends on it. Every day questions arise which can only be solved by its help. In our day-to-day engagements with one another, Woolf here argues, we communicate as black boxes, as unknown entities that use character reading as what she calls a means of bridging the gulf between each other and establishing a common ground for communication. If all people as social creatures engage to some extent with the black box interaction models, then the Woolfian literary author becomes an extreme form of this norm. The writer's primary duty, Woolf asserts, is to describe modern character beautifully if possible, truthfully at any rate. And much like Tomkins ridiculed Freud and set his black box theory of affect in contradistinction to the Freudian drives, Woolf pits her understanding of literary purpose against an established, and to her mind, too rigid existing model. So the main fall man in her account is Arnold Bennett, though she does reference a few other Edwardian authors as well. And his foremost literary crime consists in paying too much attention to describing the material world, houses, factories, upholstery, and other such external trappings. These material details constitute, to Woolf's thinking, obstacles and impediments to what she believes should be an author's main priority, catching the feelings and ideas of the characters. Now, in calling for this emphasis, Woolf invokes, I would say, a black box literary aesthetic. Because by seeking to represent the invisible interior world of human character, Woolf is privileging the same realm of complex subjectivity, suggestive associations, and pluralized meaning that Tomkins explores in his affect theories. As Woolf puts it, the most real characters are those with the power to make you think not merely of the character itself, but of all sorts of things through its eyes, of religion, of love, of war, of peace, of family life, of balls in country towns, sunsets, moonrises, the immortality of the soul. Gets big. Characters as complex black boxes wield the social power to both represent and evoke these myriad associations. They become, in Woolf's ideal world, dynamic and flexible figures capable of interacting differently with each reader. As she explains it, you see one thing in character, and I another. You say it means this, and I that. Thus, Mrs. Brown can be treated in an infinite variety of ways. These lines here disavow the possibility of any single representation emerging as the only, or the best, or the definitive way of reading a character's personality. For Woolf, literature offers a medium, then, that can strike the same balance that Tomkins' affect theory aimed at, to simultaneously catch character and allow multiple possibilities to jostle and echo with one another. So to sum it up, then, we have these two theorists of personality, one a psychologist and one an author, and their understandings of human subjectivity come together under the umbrella term of the cybernetic black box. And I'd now like to look at how this shared theoretical perspective offers a model for approaching one of Virginia Woolf's most extreme examples of black box fiction, her 1931 novel, The Waves. And I'm focusing on The Waves here today because even if all Woolf's novels ostensibly pursue this core drive to catch character, the formal experiment she conducts in this book kind of leaves the rest of them in the dust, I think, when it comes to showcasing the associative, shifting, affect-driven networks that make up character. So for anyone who has not read The Waves, this novel is split into 9 segments, and they trace the lives of 6 characters as they progress from childhood through adolescence, adulthood, and then old age. And we first meet them as children in these lines. So each character here is registering a visual or a sonic perception at the moment that he or she wakes up. So I see a ring, said Bernard, hanging above me. It quivers and hangs in a loop of light. I see a slab of pale yellow, said Susan, spreading away until it meets a purple stripe. I see a globe, said Neville. I hear a sound, said Rhoda. I see a crimson tassel, said Ginny. And I hear something stamping, said Lewis. A great beast's foot is chained. It stamps and stamps and stamps. Throughout the novel, all we have access to as readers are statements like this of what each character said. And they're not really vocalizations, but they float somewhere between the realm of speech and thought and feeling. Kind of think of them as just these amorphous transmissions. No external narration intervenes to contextualize or explain the novel's world outside of these characters' utterances. So if we think back to Woolf's essays, you can see that it's a pretty blatant repudiation of the Arnold Bennett material trappings descriptive aesthetic. But we gradually do realize as we follow these characters that we are following them through their lives and listening in on their individual affective responses to a series of experiences, both shared and unique. Now, the way in which Woolf excises all explicit narration and focuses on her characters' varied modes of engaging with the world brings the waves into dialogue with a specific strategy for dealing with black boxes. And it's one that both cyberneticist Ross Ashby and our buddy here, Silvan Tomkins, propose. And that is the embrace of knowledge gained from multiple perspectives, all of which only can offer a partial vantage point. Now, this technique is, on the one hand, eminently practical. The method of studying very large systems by studying only carefully selected aspects of them, writes Ashby, is simply what is always done in practice. And this description certainly reflects Tomkins' methodology. Tomkins repeatedly reminds us, after all, of the complex and the interwoven nature of affects and of their capacity to combine with other affects, intensify or modulate them, and suppress or reduce them. Nonetheless, though, he chooses to examine each affect in isolation. Volume 1 is positive affects. Volume 2 and 3 each deal with some of the negative affects. And this organizational decision makes his writing much more comprehensible than if he would have just followed random associations throughout the 2 books. More importantly, though, Ashby's discussion of partial knowledge belies a profound conviction about its status. Knowledge, he posits here, can certainly be partial and yet complete in itself. So even if an observer is blind to part of the picture, he's arguing here, then the available information can be sufficient to produce useful knowledge, especially if we consider it in combination with other partial viewpoints. Explaining this stance further, he writes, the point of view being taken here is that science, as represented by the observer's discoveries, is not immediately concerned with discovering what the system really is, but with coordinating the various observers' discoveries, each of which is only a portion or an aspect of the whole truth. These sentences resonate with Tomkins' argument in Praise of Multiple Perspectives. He proposes that in order to achieve full acquaintance with any object, one must vary one's perceptual perspective. Look at it now from this, now from that angle. Watch as it moves in space, etc., etc. So these two thinkers, the way they valorize multifaceted observation in tandem with the notion that each angle of observation only offers a partial view of the whole system, can help us explore additional cybernetic dimensions of Woolf's work. And this is especially true for her approach to catching character in the waves. And there are many places we could go in the novel to see this idea in action, but one of my favorites is an early episode when each character's attitude toward words acquires a unique affective kind of aura. So for Lewis, they signify the shame of his colonial roots, thanks to his Australian accent. He always feels like everyone's laughing at him, and he's ashamed of this colonial status. For Susan, she always has these associations with the earth. Words are like stones one picks up on the seashore. So they're interesting, they're enjoyable, but they're not really in any way particularly remarkable to her. Bernard, on the other hand, sees them as dynamic sources of excitement that move in patterns through the air, dividing and coming together and reestablishing new configurations. Ginny connects them to fashion, Neville sees structure and organization in their precision, and Rhoda shrinks in terror from what she sees as the utter meaninglessness of language. So each character's statement here draws our attention to a specific dimension of affective meaning that words can hold. As such, the passages emphasize both the partial nature of any one of these perspectives and the necessity of considering them all in networked conversation with one another. Woolf, though, goes even further in her novel-based exploration of partial perception, and here's where we get to radio. In her diary, she referred to the waves as an eyeless book. This phrase, which I kind of love, by situating the novel in the realm of blindness and partial or limited sensory perception, provides a jumping off point for locating the novel's rhetorical strategies at the intersection of not just cybernetic, but also radiophonic communication aesthetics. Of course, it's not only her phrase about this being an eyeless book that evokes a connection to radio. The novel's title also conjures an association with the Hertzian radio waves that were taking over the airways during the years that Woolf was working on this book. So if we take this black box device that is the radio, and maybe I should have had a picture of the actual radio box, put it into conversation with the black box idea of character that Woolf has been championing, and then spin out the connection that both of these contexts have to the ideas about partial perception that Tomkins and Ashby were theorizing, then some new cross-disciplinary lineages start to emerge. And that's where I'd like to take us in my remaining time up here. All right, radio then. That medium of disembodied sonic transmissions whose electromagnetic waves sent voices out around the globe. Early radio theory made much of the medium's existence in the realm of partial perception. For example, the German scholar of media psychology and aesthetics, Rudolf Arnheim here, had this to say in his 1936 treatise on radio. Wireless rules out a certain range of senses in a most startling way. It seems much more sensorially defective and incomplete than the other visually based arts. In wireless, the natural condition is simply that everything is lacking. It starts from a background of a silent void. However, rather than lamenting this visually lacking state of affairs, Arnheim writes, and this is why I like him as opposed to someone like Adorno, in Praise of Blindness, and this is the title of one of his chapters. He proclaims in a phrase that echoes Ashby's declaration that knowledge can be simultaneously partial and complete, that nothing is lacking in radio. Counterintuitive though it may seem, even within an ostensibly incomplete medium, everything essential is there. In these lines that posit the isolation of one sensory quality not only as a valid but also a productive means of directing our perceptual apparatuses, Arnheim affirms the aesthetic potential of the black box communication framework. Now, Woolf, it must be said, was never quite so jubilant in her praise of radio as Arnheim was. It was certainly on her mind while she was working on Waves, and among the diary entries that record her evolving sense of this novel and what she calls the voice of the sea that courses through it, she scatters in several references to the radio shows that she's been listening to at the time. So radio is going on in the backdrop there. But her attitude towards the voice that makes it into her home over the BBC channels runs the gamut more from ambivalence to uneasiness to derision and even to anxiety. In one instance, she hears it as the monolithic voice of Britain, to whom we can make no reply. No, she writes a few days later, in reference to a radio address from the Prime Minister, I don't trust him. I don't trust any human being, however loud they bellow and roll their R's. Through her variously inflective responses to the BBC, Woolf expresses her distaste for the official broadcasting station's assumptions of grandeur and authority, especially its self-appointed role as a force of natural unity and homogeneity. So we see here how the BBC kind of takes its place alongside Bennett and Freud, right, in the ranks of the inflexible and the rigid. Nonetheless, a glimmer of the Rudolf Arnheim-esque excitement about radio does find its way into Woolf's diary, particularly around the end of April 1937 when she recorded a talk for the BBC. On the 14th of the month, she writes, I've done, that is, scribbled down my BBC essay with some exhilaration. And then immediately after recording the talk, she notes that the BBC was moderately successful. That is, I got my pucker up and read with ease and emotion. Now, I can't help but detect a bit of sly glee on Woolf's part in these lines, and here's why. That talk that she has just read with ease and emotion, well, she's used it as an opportunity to unravel the BBC's pretenses from within. And she has done so by capitalizing on radio's suggestive, sonic, black box aesthetic. So to get a bit of context here, Woolf's talk was part of a BBC series called Words Fail Me, and it aired weekly lectures on aspects of meaning and pronunciation in the English language. Her contribution was officially titled Craftsmanship, though as I'll explain in a moment, she explicitly discards this label partway through the broadcast. So in terms of content, Woolf offers here what amounts to a manifesto on behalf of words. She calls for an understanding of language that allows words to signify in multiple directions rather than trying to pin them down to one meaning. So as I hope you're starting to hear, she's setting up a relationship to language that resonates with the theories she set out in her early essays and the formal experiments she puts into practice in novels like The Waves. This time, though, she takes things up a notch, and words themselves start to become black boxes. Plus, radio transmission enables her to provocatively stage her argument about words. So in the interest of allowing Woolf to speak for herself, I'm going to try and play a short clip from the 8-minute segment of this broadcast that still exists. It's pretty neat. I'd advise checking it out. It's the only existing recording we have of Virginia Woolf's voice. It's pretty awesome. So keep in mind that the segment you'll be hearing comes after Woolf has declared that the word craftsmanship is a nonsensical title for a talk about words. Craft, she argues, connotes useful, and useful would mean to express one simple statement. So if a useful statement is a statement that can mean only one thing, then it's patently ludicrous to employ the idea in the context of words. So that's where she's at right here. And then this little segment explains why that is.
Words, English words, are full of echoes, memories. associations. They've been out and about on people's lips, in their houses, in the streets, in the fields, for so many centuries. In short, they hate anything that stamps them with one meaning or confines them to one attitude, for it is our nature to change. Perhaps that is their most striking peculiarity, their need of change. It is because the truth they try to catch is many-sided, and they convey it by being many-sided, flashing first this way, then that. Thus they mean one thing to one person, another thing to another person. They are unintelligible to one generation, plain as a pikestaff to the next. And it is because of this complexity, this power to mean different things to different people, that they survive.
So this excerpt here reveals how Woolf understands words. They're many-sided, flashing suggestions that offer up 1,000 possibilities and contain so many sunken meanings that even one sentence of the simplest kind rouses the imagination, the memory, the ear, the eye. What Woolf calls the suggestive power of words grants them their status as black box entities. And in a line, if you'll recall this, that echoes the Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown essay I talked about earlier, Woolf solidifies this connection. Words, her broadcast declares, mean one thing to one person, another thing to another person. They are unintelligible to one generation, plain as pikestaff to the next. Don't have too good of a Woolf accent, so sorry about that. So I'd like to bring these ideas that have been circulating in the content of Woolf's talk back to the radio medium itself. The notion of a single word as its own black box, after all, gains some new traction in the context of radio's distinct transmission aesthetic. Take these lines by Hilda Matheson, the BBC's first director of talks. Radio, she says, is making everybody throughout the world more conscious of the sound of language. Most voices, like most smells, start an immediate memory or association which may consciously or unconsciously determine whether they are liked or not. Woolf, I would say, capitalizes on these provocative possibilities. Indeed, she orchestrates a set of rhetorical moves that I feel would make the much later media theorist Marshall McLuhan proud in the way that they strategically weave together medium and message. Rather than present her theory of language as text on a page, she articulates it over a medium whose sonic transmission focuses attention on the sensory, the suggestive, and the affect-laden nature of individual words. And if we look back to the waves, we can see that this idea is already present in something like the title term of the novel, the wave, its ability to morph and flicker across the whole affect spectrum. So this is a very quick breeze through this, but Neville's anguish is, quote, like a long wave, like a roll of heavy waters. Rhoda's disgust appears in her equation of women with walruses, whose heavy bodies are incapable of waddling to the sea and have to hope for a wave to lift them. Waving hands are linked to both the shame of homosexual desire and the joy of independence. Hay waving in the fields is a point of interest for young Susan as she's daydreaming in class. So basically, the associations proliferate outwards, different affects all accruing to this central term. So the various connections and associative leaps that accrue in this reading of waves, of words, of radios, of sound, cause the relatively contained idea of the black box character that I began with to fracture and multiply and expand. In Woolf's work, we see the black box functioning across a range of interlocking and varied scales, from the smallest units of language through to the level of characters and their interpersonal relationships, and then outward to the broader realm of public communication and technological transmission media. All three of these registers, Woolf showed us, wield the creative potential, wield their strongest creative potential only when we embrace their complex, unpredictable, multivalent meanings as the core of their truth and beauty. So to really bring things full circle, let me close here by returning to Silvan Tomkins for a moment. Now, Tomkins may not reach quite as far as Woolf does into the realm of the technological black box. And actually, in the expanded version of this, I spin out the implications of that difference between their two approaches and then use it to connect Woolf's invocation of radio to 21st century discourses of media ecology. So if anyone's interested in media ecology, we can chat about that later. But for now, let's just look at this comparison of Silvan, Tomkins, and Woolf very briefly. Woolf's radiophonic manifesto for words, I would say, does reframe the significance of at least one of Tomkins' most beautiful passages. So in these lines here, he highlights literature's rich potential for positively influencing human behavior. The world created by words, most notably in art and ideology, involves something more than an expression of affects. It is a world in which affects can be extraordinarily modulated and amplified, enriched and deepened. Imagination, aided by words, has created worlds which have completely captured the minds of men, evoking and creating rather than expressing affects, and binding the evoked affects to possibilities which are eventually actualized just because men were inspired to dream and then to act. So this talk has been all about the unpredictable associative possibilities of language and the black box communication structures that mediate our relationships with the world in so many different ways. Since I began with Tomkins and then used his cybernetically inflected theories as a way into Woolf, I think it's fitting to end here. Because by reading Tomkins' ideas about words in light of Woolf's radiophonic and linguistic black box aesthetics, we can perhaps gain a new perspective, and of course it would just be a partial perspective, on the powerful aesthetic dimensions of his work. So, thank you.